There's a paradox almost no one says out loud. Kindness, once it loses its limits, stops being a virtue. It becomes a debt you sign your own name to, while someone else collects the interest. That might sound cold, but it's exactly how Stoicism sees the matter, and it stands in complete contrast to how modern culture teaches us to think about kindness. Kindness is not measured by how much you give. Popular culture tends to measure kindness by quantity. The more you give, the better. But the Stoic philosophers, Epictetus, Seneca, Marcus Aurelius, never defined virtue that way. To them, virtue lived in sound judgment, not in boundless generosity. An act is only good when it fits reason and circumstance, not when it's the biggest thing you could possibly do. Put simply, giving without limit isn't virtue at its highest. It's the absence of judgment. This matters because it overturns a belief most people take for granted, that the more you sacrifice for others, the more you deserve respect. In reality, when someone gives without limit, they're unknowingly sending a signal, my boundaries are negotiable. And once that signal is sent, the person receiving it, even without meaning to, starts adjusting their expectations upward, asking for more. This isn't some dark truth about human nature. It's a basic law of behavior. People adapt to what's permitted, not to what's wished for. Teaching others how to treat you. There's a simple thought experiment that captures this. If a door is always left open, no one ever learns to knock. When someone is always ready to carry another person's responsibilities, financial, emotional, professional, the people around them gradually lose the motivation to solve their own problems. This isn't moral theory. It's a very familiar mechanism from behavioral psychology. Reinforced behavior repeats itself. If dependency keeps getting rewarded, dependency keeps going. Here's the irony. The person who gives without limit often believes they're helping the other person grow. But in truth, they're doing the opposite. They're stripping away the very motivation that would force that person to grow up. Marcus Aurelius, in the private notes, he wrote to himself, not for publication, but as a kind of philosophical journal, kept reminding himself of one core principle. A person truly controls only their own judgments, will, and actions. Everything else, including whether another person takes responsibility for their own life, lies outside their control. When someone keeps shouldering responsibility that was never theirs to carry, they're violating this very principle of division, what Stoic philosophy calls the dichotomy of control, the line separating what is within our power from what is not. The cost isn't in your wallet, it's in your identity. There's a side to this that gets talked about far less. The slow erosion of personal identity. When someone pours most of their energy, time, and attention into other people's needs, they gradually lose the ability to recognize their own. This isn't a sudden collapse, it happens slowly, the way a piece of metal bends under repeated stress. Each bend doesn't break it right away, but metal fatigue builds up quietly, until one day it snaps at the exact point where it was weakest. Psychologically, this resembles what researchers call compassion fatigue, the emotional depletion that comes from giving continuously without ever being replenished. People tend to assume this only happens to healthcare workers or caregivers, but in truth, it happens to anyone who stays locked in the role of the giver without limit, in any relationship at all, family, work, friendship. And here's what makes it dangerous. The person going through this rarely notices, because society keeps praising them as a good person, someone reliable, praise that reinforces the very behavior, even as that behavior quietly wears them down. The paradox of respect. There's a striking paradox in social psychology. People tend to value what's scarce and undervalue what's always available regardless of its true worth. This applies directly to the act of giving. Help that's always available, unconditional, without limit, gradually stops being seen as a gift. It starts being seen as a given. And once something is taken for granted, it no longer generates gratitude or respect. This is why, contrary to what most people assume, someone who sets clear boundaries is usually respected more than someone who always says yes. A boundary doesn't send the message, "I'm selfish." It sends the message, "My time and my capacity have value." So, where does a reasonable boundary actually lie? Stoicism doesn't preach coldness or shutting people out. The concept of oikeiosis in Stoic philosophy describes a circle of concern that expands outward, starting with yourself, then family, then community, then all of humanity. But the part that usually gets missed is this: that circle starts with yourself. It doesn't erase the self in order to begin with someone else. In other words, caring for others isn't the opposite of caring for yourself. It's an extension of it, carried out in the right order. From that view, 3 practical principles stand out. First, the division of responsibility. Before helping someone, the question isn't, "Can I help?" The answer to that is almost always yes. The real question is, does this action pull resources, time, money, emotional energy away from a responsibility that's actually mine? If it does, that's a sign of imbalance, not a sign of virtue. Second, saying no doesn't need to come wrapped in a long justification. Psychologically, the more you explain a refusal, the more likely you are to feel guilty and end up talked out of it. A refusal that's short and clear, without a chain of reasons attached, actually reflects greater self-respect. Third, accept that some relationships will shift once boundaries are set. This isn't a loss to be avoided, it's a natural filtering mechanism. A relationship that only survives because one side keeps giving without limit was, by its very nature, never a balanced relationship to begin with. A different way of looking at virtue. There's a common misreading that Stoicism teaches people to endure, sacrifice, and set aside their own needs for the sake of others. But read the original texts closely, and the opposite turns out to be true. The Stoic philosophers repeatedly emphasized autonomy and personal reason as the foundation of every moral act. An action only carries moral worth when it comes from a free, deliberate choice, not from pressure, habit, or the fear of being judged selfish for saying no. Giving out of fear is not kindness. It's a form of inner coercion, wearing the costume of morality. Seen this way, setting boundaries isn't the opposite of kindness. It's the very condition that lets kindness keep its meaning. Giving that is selective, bounded, and rooted in reason is what actually represents virtue in the true Stoic sense, not giving that is depleted, unconditional, and unexamined. A boundary is not the opposite of kindness. It is the condition that lets kindness survive without destroying the person who created it. The real question worth asking isn't, "How can I be better to others?" but this: what is your current boundary actually protecting, and is it protecting the right thing? That's a question each person has to answer for their own circumstances. There's no shared formula. Perhaps that question has already brought a specific name to mind right now: a relationship, a responsibility, some door that's always left open. And here's what's interesting. Almost everyone watching this has landed on a different name, but the exact same mechanism: